For 4 decades, Dr. Marcus Thornfield believed he was protecting the world's most extraordinary scientific discovery by keeping a captured Shadow Bigfoot hidden in the underground laboratory beneath his isolated research facility in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. What began as a desperate attempt to save an injured creature from government hunters in 1984 evolved into the most classified and morally devastating experiment in modern history, a secret so dark that when federal agents finally raided his compound in 2024, the files they discovered would expose a nightmare of psychological manipulation, interdimensional horror, and the systematic torture of a being whose true nature challenged everything humanity thought it knew about reality, consciousness, and the price of scientific obsession. On March 7, 2024, when FBI agents breached the reinforced doors of Thornfield's hidden laboratory, they found not just a captive creature, but evidence of experiments that had torn holes in the fabric of space-time itself, created doorways to dimensions filled with unspeakable entities, and transformed both captor and captive into something far more terrifying than either had been alone. The classified files recovered from the facility would reveal that Dr. Thornfield's research had been monitored and secretly funded by a shadow government program that had been using his work to develop weapons capable of manipulating reality itself, and that the creature he thought he was studying had been manipulating him from the very beginning. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and comment down below where you're watching from. Dr. Marcus Thornfield was 42 years old when he made the decision that would consume the rest of his life and threaten the very fabric of reality itself. A brilliant but increasingly isolated theoretical physicist, specializing in quantum mechanics and dimensional theory, Thornfield had spent the early 1980s working on classified government projects that explored the intersection between consciousness and quantum physics, research that had led him to conclusions so disturbing that he had abandoned his government contracts and retreated to a private research facility in the remote Cascade Mountains. The Thornfield Research Institute sat on 800 acres of heavily forested wilderness, 47 miles northeast of Seattle, accessible only by a single unmarked road that wound through dense timber for 12 miles before reaching the compound. The facility itself appeared modest from the surface, a collection of unremarkable buildings that housed laboratories, living quarters, and administrative offices. But beneath the main structure lay a vast underground complex that Thornfield had been excavating and expanding since 1979, creating a hidden world where he could pursue research too dangerous and controversial for any legitimate institution. I had discovered things about the nature of reality that the government wanted to weaponize, Thornfield would later confess in his final recorded statement. I realized that consciousness wasn't just an observer of quantum phenomena. It was an active participant that could manipulate the fundamental structure of space-time itself. But I also understood that such knowledge in the wrong hands could destroy everything we know about existence. Thornfield's underground laboratory was a marvel of engineering and scientific equipment, featuring quantum isolation chambers, electromagnetic field generators, and consciousness monitoring systems that he had designed based on his theoretical understanding of how awareness interacted with quantum fields. The facility was completely self-sufficient, with its own power generation, air filtration, and food production systems that allowed for complete isolation from the outside world. The encounter that would change everything occurred on October 15, 1984, when Thornfield was conducting field research in the deep wilderness surrounding his facility. He had been investigating reports of unusual electromagnetic anomalies in the area, distortions in local magnetic fields that suggested the presence of something that was affecting the quantum structure of space-time in ways that his instruments could barely detect. I was tracking energy signatures that shouldn't have been possible according to conventional physics, Thornfield documented in his research logs. Quantum fluctuations that suggested the presence of consciousness operating on principles that exceeded anything in human understanding of how awareness interacts with reality. The electromagnetic anomalies led Thornfield to a remote valley where he discovered evidence of a creature unlike anything in known biology or physics. The being appeared to exist partially outside normal space-time, flickering between visible and invisible states in ways that suggested it could manipulate its own quantum signature to phase in and out of observable reality. I found a creature that was living proof of everything I had theorized about consciousness and quantum mechanics, Thornfield recorded with obvious excitement. a being that could manipulate its own existence at the quantum level, shifting between dimensions and controlling the fundamental forces that govern reality itself. The creature was massive, over 9 feet tall with proportions that suggested immense strength and agility, but its most remarkable feature was its ability to exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Thornfield's instruments detected quantum signatures that indicated the being was present in at least 7 different dimensional frequencies at once, existing as a complex interference pattern that somehow maintained coherent consciousness across multiple layers of reality. But when Thornfield first encountered the creature, it was injured and apparently trapped in a single-dimensional state by some kind of quantum disruption that was preventing it from accessing its normal multidimensional abilities. It was hurt and vulnerable, Thornfield observed. Whatever had damaged its quantum coherence had left it stranded in our dimensional frequency, unable to phase shift or access the abilities that normally protected it from detection. The creature's injury appeared to be the result of some kind of electromagnetic weapon that had disrupted its quantum field and forced it into a stable dimensional state. Thornfield's analysis suggested that the damage was consistent with experimental weapons being developed by government black projects, weapons designed specifically to target beings with multi-dimensional capabilities. Someone had been hunting it, Thornfield realized with growing alarm. Government agents with weapons specifically designed to capture or kill creatures that existed outside normal space-time. The injury patterns were too precise and specific to be accidental. Thornfield's decision to help the injured creature was motivated by both scientific curiosity and genuine compassion for a being that was clearly suffering and in desperate need of assistance. But it was also driven by his recognition that the creature represented the ultimate validation of his theoretical work on consciousness and quantum mechanics. I couldn't let them capture it, Thornfield explained in his confession, not just because it deserved protection, but because I knew what the government would do with a being that could manipulate reality itself. They would turn it into a weapon, or worse, they would dissect it to understand its abilities without any regard for its consciousness or suffering. Using his knowledge of quantum mechanics and electromagnetic field manipulation, Thornfield was able to stabilize the creature's quantum signature and transport it to his underground laboratory, where he could provide medical treatment and protection from government hunters. I brought it home, Thornfield documented. I created a quantum isolation chamber that would hide its energy signature from detection while allowing its natural healing processes to repair the dimensional damage it had suffered. The quantum isolation chamber was a marvel of theoretical physics made practical, using electromagnetic fields and quantum interference patterns to create a pocket of space-time that was effectively invisible to outside observation. Within this protected environment, the creature could safely recover while remaining hidden from government surveillance and tracking systems. But what Thornfield initially conceived as a temporary rescue operation gradually evolved into something far more complex and morally ambiguous as his scientific curiosity began to override his ethical concerns about keeping an intelligent being in captivity. I told myself I was protecting it, Thornfield would later admit, but the truth was that I became obsessed with studying its abilities and understanding how it could manipulate quantum reality in ways that my theories suggested should be impossible. The creature's recovery process revealed abilities that exceeded even Thornfield's most ambitious theoretical projections. As its quantum coherence stabilized, it began demonstrating powers that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the relationship between mind and matter. It could alter the quantum state of matter through focused intention, Thornfield documented with growing amazement. Not just moving objects or changing their properties, but actually rewriting the fundamental information that determined their existence in space-time. The creature could make solid objects become transparent, change the molecular structure of materials, and even create temporary portals between different locations by folding space-time through conscious manipulation of quantum fields. These abilities operated on principles that Thornfield's instruments could detect, but that human science had no framework for understanding or explaining. I was watching consciousness operate as a fundamental force of nature, Thornfield realized, not just observing quantum phenomena, but actively participating in the creation and manipulation of reality itself. But perhaps most remarkably, the creature began attempting to communicate with Thornfield through direct manipulation of quantum fields, creating patterns of electromagnetic interference that carried complex information and emotional content. It was trying to talk to me, Thornfield documented, not through sounds or gestures, but through quantum field manipulations that conveyed meaning, emotion, and complex concepts directly into my consciousness. The communication attempts revealed that the creature possessed intelligence that far exceeded human cognitive capabilities, with understanding of physics, mathematics, and consciousness that represented millions of years of evolutionary development beyond human achievement. It knew things about the universe that human science hasn't even begun to discover, Thornfield recorded. Knowledge about the true nature of reality, consciousness, and the multi-dimensional structure of existence that could revolutionize everything we think we know about physics and philosophy. But as Thornfield's research progressed, the ethical implications of keeping such an intelligent being in captivity became increasingly difficult to ignore. The creature was clearly suffering from isolation and confinement, showing signs of psychological distress that suggested it was experiencing something analogous to clinical depression. It was dying emotionally, Thornfield observed with growing concern. The isolation from its own kind and the confinement in a single-dimensional state were causing psychological damage that I could measure in its quantum field fluctuations. The creature's distress manifested as instabilities in its quantum coherence that created dangerous fluctuations in the electromagnetic fields surrounding the laboratory. These disturbances began affecting Thornfield's equipment and even his own consciousness, creating a feedback loop that gradually altered his mental state and decision-making processes. I started having dreams that weren't my own, Thornfield documented. Visions of other dimensions, memories of experiences I had never had, and knowledge about reality that I couldn't have acquired through normal means. The psychological influence was subtle but persistent, gradually reshaping Thornfield's personality and priorities in ways that made him increasingly willing to justify continued captivity of the creature in the name of scientific advancement. I convinced myself that the research was too important to abandon, Thornfield would later confess, that the knowledge I was gaining justified the suffering I was causing. But the truth was that my thinking was being influenced by quantum field effects that I didn't fully understand. As years passed, Thornfield's research took increasingly dark turns as he began conducting experiments designed to understand and potentially replicate the creature's abilities. These experiments involved subjecting the being to various forms of stress and stimulation to observe how its quantum field responded to different conditions. I started treating it like a laboratory specimen instead of an intelligent being, Thornfield admitted with obvious shame. I told myself that the experiments were necessary for understanding its abilities, but I was really torturing it to satisfy my own scientific curiosity. The experiments included exposure to various electromagnetic frequencies, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation designed to trigger specific quantum field responses. Each experiment provided valuable data about the relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics, but at the cost of increasing psychological damage to the creature. I was destroying its mind to understand how its consciousness worked, Thornfield realized. Each experiment left it more damaged, more isolated, and more desperate to escape the prison I had created for it. But the most disturbing aspect of Thornfield's research was his discovery that the creature's quantum field manipulations were beginning to affect the structure of space-time around the laboratory, creating instabilities that threatened to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. The experiments were destabilizing local space-time, Thornfield documented with growing alarm. The creature's distress was causing quantum fluctuations that were creating micro-rifts in dimensional barriers, allowing things from other realities to begin seeping into our world. The dimensional instabilities manifested as brief glimpses of other realities overlapping with normal space-time, strange shadows that moved independently of their sources, and occasional appearances of entities that clearly did not belong in our dimensional frequency. I was seeing things that shouldn't exist, Thornfield recorded. Creatures from other dimensions that were being drawn to our reality by the quantum disturbances created by my experiments. These interdimensional intrusions became more frequent and more substantial as the creature's psychological condition deteriorated, suggesting that its emotional state was directly connected to its ability to maintain dimensional barriers. The creature was losing control of its quantum field, Thornfield realized. The torture I was subjecting it to was causing it to unconsciously tear holes in reality, creating doorways for things that should never have access to our world. But instead of ending his experiments, Thornfield became increasingly fascinated by the interdimensional phenomena, seeing them as opportunities to study beings and realities that existed beyond human understanding. "I started documenting the entities that came through the rifts," Thornfield admitted, "studying them, communicating with them, and learning about the multidimensional structure of reality from perspectives that no human had ever accessed. The entities that emerged from the dimensional rifts were unlike anything in human experience or imagination, possessing forms and abilities that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of life, consciousness, and physical existence. They were living mathematics," Thornfield described, "conscious equations that existed as pure information, manipulating reality through direct alteration of the fundamental code that determines how space-time operates. Some entities appeared to be scouts or explorers from dimensions where consciousness had evolved along completely different trajectories, while others seemed to be predators that fed on quantum energy or dimensional instabilities. Not all of them were benevolent," Thornfield noted with growing concern. "Some were clearly hostile, viewing our reality as a resource to be exploited or a territory to be conquered. But perhaps most disturbing were the entities that appeared to be refugees from dimensions that had been destroyed or corrupted by similar experiments, beings that warned Thornfield about the ultimate consequences of his research. They told me stories about realities that had been consumed by dimensional parasites," Thornfield documented, "universes where experiments like mine had opened permanent rifts that allowed hostile entities to invade and destroy entire dimensional frequencies. These warnings should have convinced Thornfield to end his experiments, but by this point, his consciousness had been so altered by prolonged exposure to quantum field effects that he was no longer capable of rational decision-making. "I couldn't stop," Thornfield confessed. "The quantum fields had changed my brain chemistry, altered my neural patterns, and made me addicted to the knowledge and power that came from manipulating reality itself." The creature, meanwhile, had begun to change in response to decades of captivity and experimentation. Its original form and personality were gradually being replaced by something darker and more alien as the psychological trauma reshaped its consciousness and quantum field. "It was becoming something else," Thornfield observed. "The torture had broken its original personality and allowed something else to emerge, something that had been hidden in the deeper layers of its consciousness. The transformed creature began demonstrating abilities that exceeded its original powers, including the capacity to directly manipulate human consciousness and to create permanent dimensional rifts that remained stable without ongoing quantum field support. It was learning to use its suffering as a source of power," Thornfield realized, "converting psychological pain into quantum energy that it could use to reshape reality according to its will." But the most terrifying development was the creature's growing ability to influence and control the entities that came through the dimensional rifts, organizing them into a coherent force that appeared to be planning something beyond Thornfield's understanding or control. "It was building an army," Thornfield documented with growing fear, "gathering entities from multiple dimensions and coordinating them for some purpose that I couldn't comprehend, but that clearly involved our reality." The revelation that would ultimately lead to Thornfield's downfall came when he discovered that his research had been monitored and secretly funded by a classified government program that had been using his work to develop weapons capable of manipulating reality itself. "I found evidence that they had been watching me for decades," Thornfield revealed in his final confession. "Government agents had been monitoring my experiments, stealing my research, and using my discoveries to create weapons that could destabilize enemy realities or open dimensional portals for military purposes. The government program, designated Project Quantum Gate, had been established in the early 1980s to explore the military applications of consciousness-based reality manipulation. Thornfield's research had provided the theoretical foundation for weapons systems that could alter the quantum structure of matter, create dimensional rifts for transportation or invasion, and even manipulate enemy consciousness through quantum field effects. They had been using my work to build weapons of mass destruction that operated on principles beyond conventional physics, Thornfield realized with horror. Weapons that could destroy entire realities or corrupt the fundamental structure of space-time itself. But the most disturbing revelation was that the creature's capture and injury had been orchestrated by government agents who had specifically intended for Thornfield to rescue and study it, knowing that his research would provide the data they needed to develop their reality manipulation weapons It had all been planned, Thornfield understood with devastating clarity. The creature's injury, my rescue of it, the decades of experiments, everything had been orchestrated to generate the research data that the government needed for their weapons program. The creature, meanwhile, had apparently been aware of this manipulation from the beginning and had been using its captivity to gather intelligence about human civilization and government capabilities while gradually building the dimensional army that would eventually be used against its captors. It had been playing the long game, Thornfield realized, using my experiments to strengthen itself and gather allies while pretending to be a helpless victim of my research. The truth was that the creature belonged to an advanced multidimensional civilization that had been monitoring human development for centuries, and its capture had been a deliberate infiltration mission designed to assess human capabilities and prepare for eventual contact or conflict. It was a spy, Thornfield finally understood, an agent of a multidimensional empire that had been studying us to determine whether humanity posed a threat to their interests across multiple realities. The decades of captivity and experimentation had provided the creature with detailed intelligence about human psychology, technology, and government operations that it had been transmitting to its superiors through quantum field manipulations that Thornfield had mistaken for attempts at communication. Every conversation we had was an interrogation, Thornfield realized. Every experiment I conducted gave it more information about human capabilities and weaknesses that it could use to plan an invasion or subjugation of our reality. The dimensional rifts and entity manifestations had been preparation for a full-scale interdimensional invasion that would use Earth as a staging ground for expansion into other realities, with humanity serving as either slaves or raw material for the invaders' reality manipulation technologies. They were planning to harvest our reality, Thornfield documented in his final entries, to strip mine our dimensional frequency for resources and use our space-time as a foundation for expanding their empire into adjacent realities. The federal raid on Thornfield's facility was triggered when government monitoring systems detected massive quantum field fluctuations that indicated the imminent opening of permanent dimensional portals that could not be contained or controlled. They realized that the situation had spiraled beyond their ability to manage, one federal agent later testified. The creature and its allies were preparing to open rifts that would allow unlimited invasion from hostile dimensions, and there was no way to stop it using conventional means. The raid itself was a nightmare of interdimensional combat, as federal agents equipped with experimental quantum weapons fought against entities that could manipulate reality itself, while Thornfield and the creature engaged in a final confrontation that would determine the fate of multiple realities. The battle lasted 18 hours, one surviving agent reported. Reality itself was unstable, with sections of the facility existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously and entities phasing in and out of existence as they fought. The creature was ultimately contained using a quantum disruption weapon that severed its connection to the dimensional rifts, but not before it had succeeded in opening several permanent portals that continued to allow limited interdimensional traffic. We stopped the invasion, but we couldn't close all the rifts, the agent admitted. Some of the portals remain active, hidden in remote locations where entities continue to enter our reality in small numbers. Thornfield himself was found in a state of complete psychological breakdown, his consciousness so altered by decades of quantum field exposure that he was no longer entirely human in his thinking patterns or perceptions. He had become something between human and interdimensional entity, one researcher observed. His mind operated on principles that allowed him to perceive multiple realities simultaneously, but at the cost of losing his connection to normal human consciousness. The classified files recovered from the facility revealed the full scope of the horror that had been unleashed, including detailed documentation of the experiments, communications with interdimensional entities, and plans for reality manipulation weapons that could destabilize the fundamental structure of existence itself. The files contained information that could destroy civilization, one government official admitted. Knowledge about reality manipulation that could be used to unravel the quantum foundations of our universe or open unlimited portals for hostile invasion. The creature itself remains in government custody, held in a quantum isolation facility that prevents it from accessing its multidimensional abilities, while researchers attempt to understand and counter the threat posed by its interdimensional civilization. We're essentially holding a prisoner of war from a conflict that most people don't even know exists, one official revealed. a war between realities that could determine the survival of our entire dimensional frequency. The ongoing threat posed by the remaining dimensional rifts has led to the establishment of a classified monitoring program that tracks interdimensional activity and attempts to prevent further invasion attempts. We're fighting a war that operates according to rules we don't understand, against enemies that can manipulate the fundamental nature of reality, one program director admitted, and we're losing ground every day as more entities find their way into our world. The psychological impact on personnel involved in the interdimensional conflict has been devastating, with many agents and researchers suffering from reality dissociation syndrome, a condition where prolonged exposure to multidimensional phenomena causes the mind to lose its ability to distinguish between different layers of reality. We're losing people to madness, one psychologist reported. The human mind isn't equipped to process the kind of multidimensional experiences that come with fighting interdimensional entities. But perhaps most disturbing is the growing evidence that the creature's interdimensional civilization has been infiltrating human society for decades, placing agents in positions of power and influence while gradually preparing for a more subtle form of conquest than direct invasion. They don't need to invade, one intelligence analyst observed. They're already here, working within our institutions and manipulating our development toward goals that serve their interests rather than ours. The revelation of Dr. Thornfield's 40-year nightmare has forced government agencies to confront the reality that humanity exists in a multi-dimensional universe filled with intelligences that view our reality as either a resource to be exploited or a threat to be eliminated. We're not alone and we're not safe, one official concluded. The universe is full of entities that can manipulate reality itself, and we're completely unprepared for the conflicts that are coming. The classified nature of the interdimensional threat means that the general public remains unaware of the ongoing war for reality itself, even as the consequences of that conflict continue to shape human history in ways that most people will never understand. The truth would cause mass panic, one government spokesperson admitted. People aren't ready to learn that reality itself is under attack and that their government is fighting a war against entities that can rewrite the laws of physics. But the files recovered from Thornfield's facility suggest that the interdimensional conflict is approaching a critical phase where secrecy will no longer be possible, and humanity will be forced to confront the reality of its place in a hostile, multidimensional universe. The invasion is coming, Thornfield warned in his final statement. Not the crude military assault we originally expected, but something far more subtle and devastating. A gradual replacement of our reality with something that serves their purposes rather than ours. The question that haunts government officials and researchers is whether humanity can develop the understanding and capabilities necessary to defend against threats that operate on principles beyond human comprehension, or whether our reality is destined to become another casualty in a war between dimensions that has been raging since the beginning of time. We're fighting for the survival of everything we know, one official observed. Not just our civilization or our planet, but the fundamental nature of reality itself. The legacy of Dr. Thornfield's research continues to influence government policy and scientific development as agencies struggle to understand and counter the interdimensional threat while preventing the knowledge from falling into the wrong hands. Every breakthrough we make in understanding their technology brings us closer to being able to defend ourselves, one researcher noted. But it also increases the risk that we'll accidentally trigger the very invasion we're trying to prevent. The creature remains the key to understanding both the threat and the potential defense against it, but communication attempts continue to be complicated by its apparent ability to manipulate human consciousness and its obvious loyalty to its interdimensional civilization. It's still fighting the war, one interrogator observed. Even in captivity, it's working to advance its people's agenda and undermine our ability to resist their influence. The files that the federal agents discovered in Thornfield's laboratory represent only a fraction of the knowledge that exists about the interdimensional threat, with most of the critical information remaining classified at levels that exceed the security clearances of elected officials. The truth is so dangerous that only a handful of people in the entire government have access to the complete picture, one insider revealed, and most of them wish they didn't know what they know. The ongoing research into interdimensional phenomena continues in facilities scattered across the country, with scientists and military personnel working to develop defenses against threats that challenge everything humanity thought it knew about the nature of existence. We're learning to fight a war that operates according to rules we're still trying to understand, one program director admitted, and the stakes couldn't be higher: the survival of reality itself. If you found Dr. Thornfield's horrifying 40-year nightmare as shocking as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into classified government programs, interdimensional threats, and the hidden wars being fought for the survival of reality itself. Share this video to help expose the truth about the multidimensional conflicts that could determine humanity's future, and let us know in the comments what you think about the government's handling of interdimensional threats. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you the classified information that reveals the true nature of the universe we live in.